On December 4th, 1872, Captain David Morehouse of the British brig Dei Gratia spotted a ship sailing erratically about 400 miles east of the Azores. As they drew closer, he recognized it, the Mary Celeste, an American merchant brigantine. He knew the captain personally, Benjamin Briggs. They'd dined together just weeks earlier in New York before both ships set sail. But something was wrong. The ship was under partial sail, moving in an uncontrolled way. Captain Morehouse tried to signal them. No response. The Mary Celeste was sailing without anyone at the helm. There are things that can't be explained. What I experienced that night changed everything. The Mary Celeste had left New York on November 7th, 1872, bound for Genoa, Italy, carrying 1,701 barrels of commercial alcohol. On board were Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and a crew of 7 experienced sailors. The ship was in excellent condition, well provisioned for the voyage. Captain Morehouse sent his first mate, Oliver DeVoe, and 2 crewmen to board the abandoned vessel and investigate. Vija Oliver DeVoe testified at the subsequent salvage hearing in Gibraltar. We aborted the Mary Celeste around 3 in the afternoon. The ship was completely deserted, not a soul on board. The main hatch was open, and about 3.5 feet of water was sloshing in the hold, but this was not an unusual amount for a ship at sea. The ship was perfectly seaworthy. She could have sailed for another 6 months without issue, but everyone was gone. What made the case even stranger was what they found inside. The cargo was intact, all 1,701 barrels of alcohol accounted for. The ship's provisions were sufficient for 6 months. There was food in the galley, including preserves and freshly baked bread. The crew's personal belongings were still in their quarters, pipes and tobacco, clothes, even Sarah Briggs's sewing materials and sheet music. Vija DeVoe described in detail. The captain's cabin was the strangest. There was an impression on the bed where someone had been lying recently. The captain's log was on the table, the last entry dated November 25th, 9 days before we found the ship. It simply recorded their position and noted fair weather. The ship's chronometer and sextant were missing, which suggested they'd been taken deliberately. But why? In Sophia's cabin, there were toys on the floor, as if she'd just been playing. Everything suggested the crew had left in an orderly fashion, taking only the navigational instruments. But to where? And why? The ship's single lifeboat was missing, its davits hanging empty. This suggested the crew had deliberately abandoned ship. But why would experienced sailors abandon a perfectly seaworthy ship with months of food and supplies remaining? Captain Morehouse himself testified. I knew Benjamin Briggs for many years. He was one of the most capable and headstrong captains I know. He would never abandon his ship without overwhelming cause, and he certainly wouldn't leave his wife and young daughter to an uncertain fate unless staying on board meant certain death. But what could that threat have been? The ship showed no signs of fire, flooding, or structural damage. It's as if they all simply decided to get into the lifeboat and vanish into the ocean. The Mary Celeste was sailed to Gibraltar by a salvage crew from the Dei Gratia. A court hearing was held to determine salvage rights, during which every detail was examined. The court ultimately awarded salvage to Morehouse's crew, but at a fraction of the ship's value, suggesting that judges suspected some kind of fraud or conspiracy, though none was ever proven.
The Mary Celeste was eventually sold and continued sailing under various owners until 1885, when it was deliberately wrecked in an insurance fraud scheme by its final owner. But the mystery of what happened to the 10 souls aboard in November 1872 has never been solved. No trace of Captain Briggs, his wife and daughter, or any of the 7 crew members was ever found. No wreckage of the lifeboat, no bodies. They simply vanished, from a perfectly functional ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Over 150 years later, the Mary Celeste remains one of maritime history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Dozens of theories have been proposed, from waterspouts to earthquakes to sea monsters, but none fully explain why an experienced captain would abandon a seaworthy ship with his family aboard, leaving behind food, water, cargo, and valuables. The ship was found, the people were not, and to this day, no one knows why. Leave a like if you're enjoying this, and tell me in the comments, what do you think happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste? I'd love to read your theories. In June 1947, multiple ships navigating the Strait of Malacca between Sumatra and Malaysia picked up a series of distress calls. The message was chilling and broken, transmitted in Morse code. All officers, including captain, are dead, lying in chart room and bridge, possibly whole crew dead. Then, after a brief pause, a final transmission. I die. Then, silence. The American merchant ship Silver Star was the closest vessel and immediately changed course to investigate. What the rescue crew would find aboard the Dutch freighter SS Orang Medan would become one of the most terrifying maritime mysteries ever documented. There are things that can't be explained. What I experienced that night changed everything. The Silver Star reached the Orang Medan's last known position and found the ship drifting in calm waters under a clear sky. There was no sign of fire, no visible damage, no indication of what could have caused a distress call. Captain Alexander Naisland organized a boarding party. Veja what the first mate who boarded the ship reported in the official account. We climbed aboard and called out. No response. The ship was completely silent, except for the sound of water against the hull. We searched the deck first. That's where we found them. Bodies everywhere. The entire crew, sprawled across the deck, in the corridors, in the cabins. But it wasn't just that they were dead, it was how they died. Veja what the same officer described. Their faces, I'll never forget their faces. Eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Mouths open as if they'd been screaming. Arms outstretched, frozen in positions that suggested they'd been trying to ward off something. Some were pointing at the sky. Some had their hands up as if protecting themselves from an attack. But there were no wounds, no blood, no signs of violence or struggle. They'd all died at the same time, and they died terrified. Even the ship's dog was dead, frozen mid-snarl, teeth bared at something we couldn't see. The boarding party searched for survivors. There were none. They examined the bodies for cause of death. There was nothing. No injuries, no signs of poisoning, no indication of what could have killed an entire crew simultaneously while leaving them in expressions of absolute terror. The captain of the Silver Star made the decision to tow the Orang Medan to the nearest port for a full investigation. As the crew was preparing the tow line, smoke was spotted coming from one of the cargo holds. Veja what the Silver Star's captain later stated in his report. We saw smoke rising from below deck. We had to cut the tow line immediately and evacuate our crew from the Orang Medan. Within minutes, the smoke turned to flames. The heat was incredibly intense, faster than any normal ship fire I'd witnessed in 30 years at sea. Heat was so intense we had to move the Silver Star back several hundred yards. Then the Orang Medan exploded. The explosion was massive, completely destroying the ship. It sank within minutes, taking all the bodies and whatever evidence might have explained what happened down with it. The official explanation, such as it was, suggested the Orang Medan was carrying some kind of hazardous cargo, possibly chemicals or poorly secured materials that had leaked, creating toxic fumes that killed the crew. The subsequent fire was blamed on these same materials spontaneously igniting. But that explanation doesn't account for the crew's expressions of terror, the fact that they all died simultaneously. and the specific positions of the bodies, suggesting they were trying to defend themselves against something no one else could see. Some researchers have suggested the Orang Medan was involved in illegal transport of nerve gas or biological weapons, materials left over from World War II. If poisonous gas had leaked, it could explain the sudden deaths of the crew, but it doesn't explain the terror on their faces, the defensive positions, or why the leak would occur in calm seas with no apparent accident or damage. Others have proposed more outlandish theories: paranormal activity, encounters with unknown sea creatures, even extraterrestrial involvement, but these remain speculation. What makes the Orang Medan case particularly difficult to investigate is that very little physical evidence survived the ship's sinking. Official records of the vessel are scarce or non-existent. Some researchers have even questioned whether the ship was real, suggesting the entire incident might be an elaborate hoax. However, multiple sources reference the incident, including the Dutch newspaper De Locomotieve in 1948, and accounts from crew members of the Silver Star who witnessed the boarding and the ship's destruction. The American Coast Guard's official records include references to the distress calls received. Whether hoax or reality, the image remains burned into maritime lore. A ship full of dead sailors, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror, dying from no visible cause while trying to protect themselves from something no one else could see. On November 15, 1931, Captain Sidney Cornwell made the hardest decision of his career: abandon the SS Beichimo, a 1,322-ton cargo ship trapped in pack ice off the coast of Alaska. Winter darkness was descending, temperatures were plummeting, and staying aboard meant risking his crew's lives with no guarantee the ship would survive the Arctic winter. But what he couldn't imagine was that his abandoned ship would begin a second life as a ghost vessel, sailing the Arctic waters without a crew for nearly 40 years. There are things that can't be explained. What I experienced that night changed everything. The Beichimo had been built in Sweden in 1914 for German owners. After World War I, it was ceded to Britain as war reparations, then purchased by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1921 for £15,000. For 9 years, it successfully sailed along Canada's northern coast, visiting trading posts and collecting furs. In October 1931, loaded with $58,000 worth of furs, the Beichimo became trapped in pack ice. Captain Cornwell and his crew of 15 waited, hoping the ice would break up. It didn't. On November 24th, a powerful blizzard hit. When it cleared, the ship had vanished from sight. Captain Cornwell concluded it must have been crushed by the ice and sunk.
But a few days later, an Inuit hunter told them the Beichimo had been seen about 45 miles away, still afloat and intact. The crew traveled to it, retrieved the most valuable furs, then abandoned the ship permanently, certain it would sink within days. It didn't. Over the next 38 years, the Beichimo was sighted dozens of times, sailing through the Arctic waters without any crew on board. Vejawut Leslie Melvin, who was traveling to Nome by dog sled in March 1932, reported in his journal, "I saw it floating near the coast, moving slowly with the ice. The ship looked intact. Its sails were torn and hanging from the masts, but the hull seemed sound. There was absolutely no one on board. No smoke from the stack, no lights, no movement, but it was sailing, drifting with the currents and ice as if it were alive. It was the strangest and most unsettling thing I've ever witnessed in all my years in the Arctic. A dead ship that refused to die." In March 1933, a group of Inuit hunters found the Beichimo and boarded it, hoping to salvage materials. But an unexpected storm struck, trapping them on the vessel for 10 days. When the storm finally cleared, they discovered the ship had drifted approximately 250 miles from where they'd initially boarded. Vejawut Isabel Wiley Hutchinson, a Scottish botanist who was a passenger on the Trader and boarded the Beichimo in August 1933, testified,
We went aboard with the crew of the trader. The ship was in remarkable condition for a vessel abandoned nearly 2 years prior. Everything was still there, frozen in time. Furniture, bedding, provisions. There was even a bucket of sweet pickles and a silver toast rack in the galley, perfectly preserved by the cold. The Inupiaq people who boarded with us took some bedding and canvas, but I couldn't stay long. The atmosphere on board was deeply unsettling. You felt like an intruder, as if the ship itself resented your presence. The Beichimo continued its ghost voyage. In 1934, it was spotted off the coast of Alaska. In 1935, near Wainwright. In 1939, it appeared again, and this time someone attempted to capture it. Vejawood Captain Hugh Polson recounted after his attempt to salvage the ship. I managed to get close enough to throw lines aboard and moor alongside the Beichimo. I was preparing to board and inspect her cargo when the wind suddenly shifted. Within minutes, we were in the middle of a fierce Arctic storm. The ice was crushing in around us. I had no choice but to cut the lines and get my ship to safety. When I returned the next day, the Beichimo had vanished again. That ship didn't want to be caught. I know it sounds absurd, but it felt like it had a will of its own, a determination to keep sailing. Sightings decreased during World War II when few vessels operated in those waters, but they resumed after the war ended. The Beichimo was spotted in 1962, still drifting along the Beaufort Sea coast. The last confirmed sighting came in 1969, 38 years after the ship's abandonment. A group of Inuit hunters saw it trapped in pack ice near the Beaufort Sea. They reported it was still remarkably intact, standing upright, its hull sound, despite nearly 40 decades of Arctic conditions. How does a ship without a crew, without a running engine, without anyone to maintain or navigate it, survive for 38 years in some of the harshest conditions on Earth? How does it travel hundreds of miles through ice-chalked waters, appearing and disappearing like a phantom? How does it evade capture time and again, as if consciously avoiding anyone who tries to board it? These questions have no answers. The Beichimo remains one of the most documented ghost ships in maritime history, with dozens of independent witnesses reporting sightings over nearly 40 decades. Experienced sailors, scientists, indigenous hunters all saw the same thing, an abandoned ship that refused to sink, sailing the Arctic alone.
On January 31st, 1921, the Carol A. Deering, a 5-masted commercial schooner, was found hard aground on Diamond Shoals off the coast of North Carolina. It was one of the most treacherous areas along the Atlantic coast, known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic for the hundreds of ships that had wrecked there. But what made the Deering's grounding unusual wasn't where it happened, but what investigators found when they boarded. A fully provisioned ship with no crew, freshly cooked food in the galley, and evidence suggesting the entire crew had vanished just hours before the ship ran aground. There's things that can't be explained. What I experienced that night changed everything. The Carol A. Deering had left Norfolk, Virginia on August 21st, 1920, bound for Rio de Janeiro with a cargo of coal. The ship was captained by Willis B. Wormel, an experienced 66-year-old master. The crew consisted of 10 men, including the captain's son. The voyage to Rio was uneventful. On December 1st, the ship left Rio to return to Norfolk. This is when things began to go wrong. Captain Wormel became ill during the return voyage. On January 9th, 1921, the Deering stopped at the Barbados for supplies. While there, the captain complained to the port's authorities about his first mate, Charles B. McKellen, saying the man was insubordinate and incompetent. On January 28th, 3 days before running aground, the Deering passed the Cape Lookout lightship off the coast of North Carolina. The lightship keeper noticed something odd. Vejawood Captain Jacobson of the lightship testified. A man on the Deering hailed us, shouting that the ship had lost its anchors, but the man wasn't wearing an officer's uniform. He was dressed as a common sailor. That was highly unusual. Officers always handle communications with other vessels, not crew members, and his manner was strange, agitated. I reported it immediately, but before anyone could investigate, the Deering had sailed on. 2 days later, on January 30th, the Deering was spotted by a passing steamer. It appeared to be sailing normally under full sail. But by January 31st, it was found grounded on Diamond Shoals, sails set but torn, completely abandoned. The ship was so firmly grounded on the dangerous shoals that Coast Guard couldn't reach it for 4 days. When they finally boarded on February 4th, what they found was deeply unsettling. Veja with the Coast Guard boarding officer reported. The ship was completely deserted. Every crew member was gone. Their personal belongings were still in their quarters, but several things were missing. All the ship's navigational equipment, the life rafts, and strangely, all the crew's personal effects from the captain's and officers' cabins were gone, but the common sailors' belongings remained. In the galley, we found food that had been recently cooked. The table was set for a meal as if they'd been about to eat when something caused them to abandon ship immediately. The ship's log was missing, making it impossible to know what had happened in the days before the grounding. The 2 lifeboats were gone, suggesting the crew had deliberately abandoned the vessel. But why? The ship, though grounded, was in relatively good condition. There was no fire, no flooding, no apparent danger that would force an immediate evacuation. Even more puzzling, navigation charts showed the Deering had been deliberately sailed onto the shoals. The sails were still set, as if someone had been sailing the ship right up until it grounded, then immediately abandoned it. Investigation revealed other mysteries. The steering wheel was broken, though it was unclear if this happened before or after the grounding. The ship's anchor chains had been chopped clean through with an axe, confirming what the lightship keeper reported. The Deering had lost its anchors. But why would anyone cut anchor chains at sea? Captain Wormel's daughter, Lula Wormel, was interviewed extensively. She provided disturbing context. My father wrote to me from Barbados. He was worried about the first mate, Mr. McKellen. He said the man was difficult and defiant. My father had never complained about a crew member before in all his years at sea. He was planning to have McKellen removed when they reached Norfolk. I believe something happened on that return voyage. I believe the crew mutinied.
The mutiny theory gained traction. If McClellan and possibly other crew members had overthrown Captain Wormel, this would explain the common sailor hailing the lightship instead of an officer. It would explain the missing officer's effects while sailors' belongings remained. And it would explain why they abandoned ship to escape prosecution. But this theory has problems. If the crew mutinied, why set the ship deliberately aground where it would be quickly found? Why not just take the lifeboats at sea? And what happened to Captain Wormel's body? No bodies were ever found aboard the Deering. Other theories emerged. Some suggested pirates had boarded the ship, killed the crew, and looted the vessel. But nothing of value was taken. The cargo was intact. Others proposed the crew encountered something at sea so terrifying they fled in the lifeboats. But what could that be? The most disturbing theory came from the timing. In the same weeks the Deering was found abandoned, 9 other ships vanished in the same general area of the Atlantic. 9 ships, all gone without explanation. Some researchers suggested a coordinated attack, possibly by Soviet forces or rum runners involved in the illegal alcohol trade during Prohibition. In April 1921, a bottle washed ashore in North Carolina containing a note allegedly written by the Deering's engineer. Deering captured by oil-burning boat, something like chaser, taking off everything, including handcuffs and crew. Vessel going north, hurry. But handwriting analysis proved the note was a hoax. Despite a massive investigation involving the FBI, Coast Guard, and State Department, no trace of the 10 crew members was found. No bodies, no wreckage from the lifeboats, no survivors came forward. The Carroll A. Deering was eventually dynamited and destroyed where it lay, its cargo salvaged, but its mystery intact. Captain Willis B. Wormel,
His son and the other 8 crew members simply vanished, leaving behind a fully provisioned ship with a meal ready to be eaten. Over a century later, the case remains unsolved. Was it mutiny, pirates, something even stranger? No one knows. The ghost ship of Diamond Shoals took its secrets to the bottom of the Atlantic, and the 10 men who sailed aboard her were never seen again.